So hi everybody, good afternoon. My name is Teresa and I am the project lead of the Tech to the Space investment program. Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to our webinar about how to prepare your investor speech by Mark Wilson from Strategic Technology Bioconsulting. As you already know, this is the last webinar part of your investment readiness process. I would like to remind you that you will be able to find the recording of the other webinars at the InnoRate website. The company selection process is now closed and the selected companies will attend Academy's demo days on 8 and 9 of December and the pitching sessions on the 15 and 16 of December. All companies will be communicated about it shortly together with calendar invites for the different sessions. As usual, and before starting with the webinar, I would like to share the housekeeping rules for having a smooth session. Please be aware that we are recording the session. If you are not okay with that, please write us a message and we will cut you from the recording. Please rename yourself with your name, surname, and your company name. And it's always preferred to see you all, so please turn on your camera if your connection allows it. For a better communication, we kindly ask you to turn off your microphone and to write your questions in the chat. We will have a specific slots for Q&A between Mark presentations. Remember that the chat will be active all session and that you can use it anytime to reach questions to Mark, to myself, or even other CEOs of the room. And with this information said, I will not take more time to introduce you to Mark Wilson and his really useful presentation. Hi, Mark. The floor is yours. But you are still mute, Mark. We cannot hear you. I think Mark is solving these issues that we all have when we are sharing our screen and jumping into presentations.
Okay, right. So
now we can hear you. Now it's perfect. Thank you.
That's a good start. We did the chat 20 minutes ago. Everything was working, but let me just try and get that. Can you see the full screen? Is it going to come up full screen for us?
Still not full screen.
No.
We promise that we make it work earlier.
Okay.
Now we see it.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Perfect. Welcome, Mark.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you for taking an hour out of a busy day for this session. We've got an hour together to discuss investor pitches. This is really aimed at people perhaps at a beginning sort of process of pitching and fundraising, maybe with some experience, but it's really trying to cover the basic points, make sure that we're giving you a primer and trying to explain what people are expecting in this kind of process. My background is 20 plus years at GlaxoSmithKline. I'm not from the space industry. I'm a biotech pharma person. What investors expect to see is very similar across the different industry disciplines. And GSK, I worked for a period establishing a spin-out and divestment function in the corporate venture group, SR1. And for the last 3 years, I've worked with a series of small companies across Europe in the biotech field. So the first thing I would like to sort of mention to you is please try and consider the perspective of the audience. This is a general point, but in terms of investor pitches, I think you are really addressing investors who are quite familiar with your specific field. So I encourage you not to worry about investors who may not have familiarity with the subsector of a space industry or the subsector of the particular industry. Usually when you see things progress, it is with people who really understand the problem and understand that sector of the industry. So I encourage you to articulate the problem, but don't worry about reaching out to everybody. You're really addressing those people that understand what the problem is, and that's the key group. The first thing you have to do is really state what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Why is there something good to be done here? Why is there an issue? Why is there a problem? What's the, if you like, customer pain? What is it that really needs fixing? And I encourage you to say fairly early in the presentation what your solution is. We have a technology to do X, we have a technology to do Y. So by all means include customer stories later, but please, I suggest you don't start with long introductions, with long analogies. People want to know what you've got, what's the problem, what's the technology, and they'll be deciding very early on, is that of interest? Do I want to really pay attention, or am I going to write some notes for the next 10 minutes and figure who I'm going to call? Again, the audience typically has spent an hour or two or all day listening to pitches. So it's very rare that you go in and you have a fresh audience. So try and be very present, as it were, be engaged, be sort of really involved in what's going on. A quick reminder, the only purpose of a pitch is to interest somebody in having a longer conversation with you. So particularly for shorter pitches, don't worry about trying to cover everything. It will be impossible to cover everything. What you need to do is cover enough of the key points that people understand that you're professional, understand that you have considered the market opportunity, believe that you have some credibility, and that you are worth investing half an hour in for a follow-up discussion to actually begin to see what you might have. So don't try and cover everything. And remember that just as a CV or a resume is an advert to get you the job interview, the pitch is an advert. It's a short presentation, a professional presentation, but a short presentation to get you through to the next stage, which is a discussion one-on-one with an investor. So I'm going to divide the core material into two sections. One is what I term the core pitch, and I'll explain what that is as we go through it. And the second is how you exploit the opportunity. So I'm going to pause for questions and discussion at the end of each section. The first section is the part that people tend to get, tend to do well. They tend to cover this pretty thoroughly, but hopefully there'll be some pointers for you. Very frequently I see that people do the first part well and then not really explain how they're going to exploit the opportunity. So let's dive in. You have to state the high-level customer problem as the very beginning. So wherever you're working, go just one level up. So what's the macro level problem? You can take, on a 7-8 minute pitch, you can take 2 slides to explain what it is that you're doing. You need to guide people in a little bit, but don't start way too high. So an example which I hope translates in the modern environment with all the discussion of the vaccine trials would be clinical trial patient recruitment. So you might want to include a quote or a statement, something of that type. But every second's delay costs $17. 1 month's delay is $44 million. And the issue here, an underpinning issue, is patient recruitment and retention. How do you find the right patients to involve in a trial, and how do you keep those patients in the trial? So I would describe that as a sort of macro level problem. So use 1 slide to guide people in on a 7 or 8 minute pitch. Then jump to what it is that you actually do. So this is not new technology. Again, it's an attempt to provide an example. This is an approach known as direct-to-patient trials. So how can you address these issues? One way is to actually ship the medicines directly to the patient. This avoids the patient having to go routinely to a hospital to see a particular medic as part of the trial process. Again, you might want to include a quote, at this point, some kind of graphic or cartoon is really useful because you can actually encapsulate quite a lot of technical information in a sort of short amount of space. So that's really useful. Don't go too detailed at this point, but actually really do explain what the problem is that you're fundamentally trying to address. You do need then to explain what it is that you have. So at this point, we're at slide 2 on a short pitch, slide 3 on a longer pitch. So we haven't made the audience wait too long, but you do need to say what it is that you have. So the audience do need to know what you have or what you're developing. Explain what's really new. Explain what you have that's exciting. What's the key development? So often a picture is really useful, a sort of 3D graphic, if you like a cartoon, a graphic of some style. And that can explain a principle very well. I'm a great believer in having a photograph as well. The reason for that is that for a number of years, out licensing technologies, deals that were of millions to tens of millions, if I went with a slide deck that didn't have a photo of the equipment, people would always push back and say, is this real? Does it really exist? So I appreciate the early stage, the prototypes may look slightly rough, but I do think it's worthwhile including a photograph. We'll talk in a minute about graphs, but I think you need to explain that this really works. So what do you have? What does it do? Does it really work? But this whole section is no more than a minute or two. So investors want to know the whole proposition, but they do need to know the technology. So particularly if the team is coming from a technical background, make sure that you don't spend too long talking about the technology. You need to cover it. It's absolutely the core, but you have a minute or tops 2 minutes, and then you move on to the next thing. So I believe that you should include a slide. I think this is important. So you've told me what you have. You've shown me a picture of it of some kind. So the next thing I'd like to see is some evidence, that some reason to believe, if you like, that actually the technology will do what you say it will do. And so this is a graph just pulled from a paper on dry granulation. But actually, I would suggest don't include a stylized graph. I'd like to see one piece of actual data. So a longer pitch, you might be extravagant and have 2 slides, but a short pitch, just keep it really tight. But I do like, certainly on a 7-8 minute pitch, to see some technical evidence that what you have works. I think that's really, really good as a way of communicating. It shows that you've done the work. It creates some credibility. So I think I've been talking for 7 or 8 minutes, something of that order, and we've discussed technology, and we have the rest of the hour to go. And that's roughly the weighting you should probably give the technology. It's absolutely critical. It's absolutely the underpinning, but get in and get out and move on. There are a whole series of other questions we have to address. The next one, which is really fundamental, is the business model. So if you like, in plain English, who uses and who pays? So this is at least as important as the technology. So pause here, take time, make sure people have understood what you're saying. If possible, please mention hard numbers. Those might be from other companies, they might be from market research reports, but show that you've done your homework and that actually you have some sense of what your technology will be worth. Again, I've heard this put as, who buys and why. And the key issue here is that the key users may not be the people who actually pay for the technology. So very common in healthcare that there is an incremental improvement. It may be of great help to medics, but they potentially are not the individuals who will actually pay for the approach. So you have to consider the overall payment process as well as the use process. And again, a really common challenge that investors will make to people presenting medical device technologies, and I think it's worth considering more broadly, is does this fit the workflow? So you may have a great technology, you may have an advanced imaging system, but will medics have enough time to actually use that? If you have a system that takes an hour to use and the entire allotted time for that interaction is an hour, it may not be of help. So will it really fit into the workflow? And in that regard, there is nothing better than having gone and asked people. So will this actually work? How do you use the tools that you use? How would you use this approach? So again, really, really effective if you can quickly say, we've been to so many users, we've been to these groups, and actually this is the market feedback. Typically, people include a graph of this type. Just picking up on the earlier example, this is on clinical research organizations. You know, classically, there is a graph which shows that the market is getting bigger. Really important to distinguish between the broad market and your market. So here there's a graph on total contract research organization usage. So that's increasing at 7 to 8% a year. CAGR, that's fine. If you have a technology, as per the example here, which actually addresses phase 2, what portion of that is that market? So here, this is globally, this is still significant. So you can make a point if you're presenting this that actually this is a really large market and it's growing. But take people into the market that you're actually addressing. So I've heard this discussed as a sort of pizzas in the US fallacy. So a lot of pizzas are consumed in the US, but simply because you are selling pizzas does not necessarily mean that you will sell any. So are you selling fresh pizzas, frozen pizzas? Are you in Philly? Are you in New York? You know, really dig into the specifics of the market. And at that point, I'm going to pause. So I think a lot of people cover that very well. Don't get too hung up on the technology and really do take people through the business model and why you believe that there is something here that you can charge for. Present pricing information if you have any, really lay that out for people. I think that's really important. I don't know if there are questions, if you have comments. It would be great to have some debate from the group to hear your experiences perhaps.
Yeah. Just to let the people know that Mark cannot see the chat, so we will be doing some pauses for the questions. I see that we have a couple of questions from Maya about the presentation and about the pitch. So Maya, if you would like to address them to Mark.
No, I can speak now, right?
Yeah. Just
okay.
Just one thing. I think your microphone is a bit loud, so if you can make
it. How can I make this?
Just by the sound on your computer, you will make it. It will sound less loud.
This better?
It's a bit still loud, but.
This better. Perhaps if I. A second.
Fine for me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you now. Yes, great.
It's better, right?
Because yeah.
Headphones are really strong. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
great, thank you.
I wanted to ask Mark, is it better because sometimes to reveal all the obvious information, or is it at some point is it better to remain mysterious at some point so that you set like these traps for the obvious questions from the investors in the end? You know what I mean?
The only, I think go back the point I made. I think the only group of investors you're actually addressing are those that are smart, savvy, and know your market. Okay, everybody else is just noise in the overall picture. They may be in the room, and they may even think that's, they may think somebody else's presentation. So sorry, I think the people you're addressing are really savvy, capable professionals. So pitch your audio, your presentation for those people. Otherwise, you'll cause annoyance with people who actually might have responded very positively. So you don't need to disclose everything. Again, that's kind of one of the key points. So please don't try and cram everything in. Pick what you're deciding to present. but you should be wanting to impress really good professionals that you know this situation, you know this space, and you've done your homework to understand what the market is. So again, I think any way of sort of holding back information or if like gimmicks actually just tends to irritate people. So again, you've been sat there for 2 hours, you patiently listened to sort of 10 companies. This next company might have something of interest, but would you like it to be laid out crisply and professionally, if you were listening, or would you like there to be some kind of game or gimmick? I think it's the former. I think, if people do not understand, what you're saying, do not know that market, cannot be useful to you beyond providing the finance, then they're not the people you should be talking to. So just focus things on that group. That would be my response.
Thank you for the answer. But what about with the financial investors? Because there are different types of investors. Of course, there can be the technical, some investor from the sector on the other side that understands what you're talking about. But what about the financial ones? And it depends who from the one company you're talking to. Perhaps you're talking to the more analyzed type of person, or you're talking to the more technical person on the team.
So I think those are broadly the same. I mean, maybe you go one level higher in explaining the problem. Maybe take a little bit more time to guide people in, but I think fundamentally the pitch is very, very similar. So again, background is, if you like, having worked in a corporate VC group, I'm a great believer in people having great technical domain knowledge, but you may be addressing generalist investors. Actually, that's in some ways perhaps harder than sort of addressing investors who are very familiar with the domain. But I think you're presenting essentially the same information, because they will go away, they will due diligence, they will reach out to other experts, they will verify. So I think just at the beginning, just maybe take fractionally longer just to guide people into the problem. And the tone with that can be a challenge. Again, you have to be taking people who are non-expert into your world, but they're expert in their own world. So again, just crisply professional, one level higher, but otherwise they still need to know all of the things we're going to go through. And in a short pitch, there isn't really much scope for variation. It sounds negative, but people will want you to cover most of the points I think we're going to address.
But now I guess we're talking about the early stage investment gathering, I suppose, because there is a difference if you are in the early stage and you are, I don't know, with the A round, you are pitching to different investors at different events, and the whole conversation runs differently if you are pitching in the later stages.
So again, I'll be happy to hear your experiences or to have a discussion, but I think my advice would be simply to start more broadly, perhaps go fractionally more broadly, but I still think people want to know what's your business, what's the technology, what's the business model, is it a growing market? All of these points and all the points we're going to discuss. So I still think that's the core. The way you actually discuss that or take that forward with an investor may be different, but I think the actual core information in the pitch is sort of a hit list of essential items that really you need to cover. If you don't cover them, even with a generalist investor, if that investor goes to a sector expert, you'll simply get more questions back. So I think actually it makes sense to try and cover these points. But I appreciate, your experiences may be at odds with mine.
Thank you. And one final question, and then I will stop. Are there any differences between the on the topics that you mentioned between the B2B and B2C pitching? If you are one or the other type of company, I suppose you still have to cover the same topics, but do you think that perhaps you should approach some topics differently?
So I think my approach would be that broadly the information is the same. I don't think this is particularly controversial. The set of questions you get as a follow-up, or the evidence you'd be expected to provide, or the kind of attestations, customer feedback you'd expect to provide would be quite different. So B2C and B2B, they would expect different validation points. So, you know, one could be IP driven, one could be brand driven, one is about sort of traction with a handful of customers, one is about showing market scalability and rapid uptake, perhaps. I'm not saying those are absolutely the most critical points, but I think they're different scenarios. But I still think in many ways you have to address these key points. But again, you may introduce different evidence sources to show what you have that you're presenting. I have seen a situation where companies have presented and they have not decided whether it's B2B or B2C. And it's almost impossible to tell, to be frank, it is almost impossible to tell a coherent story in 5 to 7 minutes if you have not chosen a business model. It's almost better to either have 2 pitches, like 2 CVs, or to pick one and then let the investor guide you. But this should be B2C. Okay. But I think pick, you know, short pitch, pick one story and tell it really well. You know, again, you want the discussion. If people have a different view, if they like the technology but think your exploitation plan is misguided, great. Get into that discussion. Who knows where it goes? So I think pick one thing, but the key points are the same, but the evidence is different, is what I would say from my perspective.
Thank you. Thanks.
Mark, we have a couple of questions more from Marcus, but unfortunately he cannot use his microphone, so I will read his questions for you. The first one is, it will be even more effective to show a short 10-15 seconds video rather than a photo on the presentation.
So videos can work really well. Where videos can be very effective is actually in guiding people in on that initial part of the presentation. So if there is a complex industry process, which is going to take you 90 seconds to explain, you know, a 20-second video segment can somehow make that very clear. So feel free to use videos. They can be very effective. Obviously, if you do, make sure they're of high quality, make sure that the file will play in whatever environment you're going to use, but they can be very, very effective. I guess my feedback is that I've seen them used to more effect really early in the presentation, when you're saying there's an industry sub-process and this is our bit, rather than explaining the technology as such. But feel free to use them. It can be very helpful.
Thank you. And the next question is, if your target market is those people who understands the problem and the industry, how important is to convince them about the market potential, or will we expect them to have a grasp of this already?
So in many ways, people will have a good understanding. So they will probably understand everything you're going to say on that initial slide. But you still have to show them that you have, as I say, done your homework, you've identified a market, you scoped it, and here is an explicit size. So if you go to anybody in the pharmaceutical industry, they would understand that first slide I put up. It's kind of the benefit of trying to use an example. I would have been able to hazard a guess as to the worldwide market for phase 2 CRO activity, but it would have been a guess. And I think the same would be true for many people in the industry. So it would be correct to an order of magnitude. But if you can say it's 15 billion and growing at 7% per annum, that's helpful. So you're guiding people in. Intuitively, it feels right, but actually, look, here is the answer, here is the space. So yes, they will understand. But you may want to go one level below that. You may want to be quite specific, and we're going to attack this part of this market. So then, you know, is that 500 million or is that a 5 billion market? So just show me that you've worked that through. Somebody familiar with the industry will be listening, thinking, do I agree with that? I'm not sure I agree with that. Last time I touched that topic, you know, what did I think? What did I think about that value? So people will be sort of scrutinizing the numbers as you talk, and they'll have a good sense. But I think it's really helpful to guide people in and give a scope to the problem. That's my perspective.
Thank you so much for your reply, Mark. Maybe we can continue with the presentation.
Okay, and thank you very much for the questions. We are all trying to learn this strange art of presenting by Zoom. and it's really difficult if there's no feedback and no questions. So thank you very much. So as an observation, on say, I don't know, the last 100 pitches that I've been exposed to, I would say that most people, you know, get 7, 8, 9 on the first half on the topics we've covered. A surprising number of companies then get sort of 4, 5, 6 on this next part. So this is as important. So please worry about all of this. So what I've termed here the exploitation plan. So what do I mean by this? So at this point, if things are going well, you've convinced people that there is a problem, there's a large market, you have great technology, and you have some really good evidence that this works and could solve the problem. Beyond that, you've identified who could pay, and you have some sense of pricing. So great. So people are interested. If you carried the interest this far, you know, things are going well. So a whole set of different questions crop up in the mind of an interested listener at this point. So you have something and it's of interest. Okay, so where do we go from here? So lay out for people where you are in the state of development. You don't need to refer to technology readiness levels, but you know, in biotech, in pharma, in terms of that clinical pathway, in terms of that approval pathway, where are you? How many years will it be before you actually get to key milestones? So show a timeline. Doesn't have to be too detailed, but you can actually put up a reasonable amount of information if you want. It's you know, when you're used to seeing these pitches, it's really quite quick as a process to assimilate a development plan. It's much better to have slightly more information, particularly if you're presenting to a knowledgeable audience, than too little. So actually include a genuine timeline, include sort of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 interim milestones, have 1 or 2 notes, that's fine as a slide. That will be assimilated really quickly by people who are familiar with the domain. Try and avoid anything that's, if you like, too simplistic, because you just immediately invite a whole series of questions. So actually lay out the complex path that you're traveling, but do tell people where you are. So biotech pharma, key issues here are trial stages and the regulatory approvals. Broadly across industries, you need to test the approach, you need to validate it, and you need to have it often approved in some fashion. So I think those are critical milestones. Beyond that, explain the market launch plans. So it's really very common that the very first market you address is slightly different than the broad market that you hope to go into. So again, the biotech pharma example, perhaps a company might launch into a rare disease space. They might actually target those organizations that are looking at orphan drugs to prove the technology, to get user feedback, to prove the benefits, to have hard numbers, and then look to explore that with a much larger user base. So I think be clear about who the early adopters will be. If the technology is actually being tested by 1 or 2 companies, please say that. Again, listen to a pitch recently and the technology was being tested by the preeminent multinational in the world in a particular domain, and it only came out in questioning. So if you have great kind of references of that type, please do mention them. Often there's a geographic issue. Understandably, people do things, you know, typically in the home market, typically in adjacent markets. They may or may not be key markets for expansion. So if you can articulate a forward path, even at an early stage, then I think that's very, very helpful. The critical point clearly is to be able to state when you expect to generate revenues. If you're already generating revenues, that's fantastic, so state that. But otherwise state when you'll generate revenues and how these will grow. So these are projections. Whether or not, you know, on examination, on diligence, people believe those projections, who knows, but have an outline, present an outline, be clear when you think things are going to happen. As a general comment, try and be clear in your mind what you're going to say as you go through the presentation and what you actually put on the slides. There is a problem in that you can be asked to pitch and asked to provide slides, and then those slides are sent off to 30 other investors or to a different group. So that's a challenge. So try and gauge how much information you actually include on the slide. But a verbal pitch obviously requires less information than a slide deck, which essentially is being provided as a report. But do include key numbers. Again, you just don't know what will happen to the deck once you've submitted it to great groups like TechTour. They're good. You know, one of the things they do is share information. You want that to happen. So minimize the information for a verbal pitch, but try and make sure that the story is told in the slides so that somebody coming to it cold without your commentary would understand the opportunity. It's just an expectation that you will discuss your competitors, but this is an opportunity. It's not wasted time because what it enables you to do is explain in what ways your unique offer is better than any of the competitors. So I suggest a little bit of sort of grounded humility is good here. What you have is doubtless great. It's often in development, but be really clear for people which one or two attributes are really differentiated. Why are you different? So don't be afraid of addressing competitors. Do it briefly. You don't need to dwell on this. But remember that the sort of presence of competitors is actually in some ways reassuring. You are not the only people that believe there is a particular market. Other organizations are addressing this with a different set of attributes to the one that your product has, but actually this is encouraging. Investors will be quite wary of organizations where the companies claim they're going to create a new market. It is much easier to push further forward where there is a kind of beachhead, where there is some kind of market, some kind of competition already. So don't be wary of discussing competitors. But I suggest you do this briefly. If people are interested, perfect for the follow-up discussion. So you need to actually, put the pitch to the other side. So to use sort of colloquial English, be clear on the ask. What is it that you are actually wanting to happen? What is it that you're looking for? So you're looking for £500,000, £1 million, £3 million, $3 million, whatever it is, in order to do the following. So a really nice way of leading into this is to state who has been involved to date, who the investors are. Might be state groups, maybe you've received grant funding, maybe you have some small private investors, maybe you have some major investors, but to actually quickly in a couple of sentences paint a picture and then explain, let's say, what the ask is in terms of funding, and I would be specific. So actually state an amount. Series A means different things to different people in different industries. So you're looking for £2.5 million to do the following activities, 1, 2, 3, 4. I suggest that you are quite clear on how you plan to use the funds. It doesn't need to be too detailed, but people do expect to understand that you're going to use that to progress into a phase 1 clinical trial, for example, or whatever the equivalent is in the space sector. And I think it's really helpful to remind people at this point of how far you are from revenues or when you expect revenues to occur. I encourage you to state long-term plans. One of the reasons for this is if you don't clearly articulate where you think the company might go in the longer term, there's a question raised around, do you really understand where you're taking this? And if you don't provide a credible plan, then even an outline, then again, that raises questions. So people may really like the technology, they may really like the company, but they may be firmly of the view that actually this is going to be an acquisition for a larger company in 5 years' time. So you don't need to be explicit, but if in that circumstance you are adamantly arguing that the company will stay independent for 10 years, there's a sort of dissonance on the investor side. So I think just be realistic, paint a couple of realistic options. Don't need too much detail on this, but it does provide a sense of direction. Okay. I am a technologist at heart. So if you do not talk to me about IP, I will come and ask. So clearly you can tell from that that I am, I'm not a brand, I'm not a consumer person. In a short pitch, my suggestion is leave it out. If there's somebody like me in the audience, I will just ask you in the questions to comment on your patent estate. So not a problem. In a longer pitch, if you're lucky enough to have 8 minutes, in 8 minutes you can cover most things. So I would mention it, but I'd mention it really briefly. So typically put some box up. There's an example here on the slide. Put this up on one of the other slides, and you can just mention in passing that you have the patent applications progressing, whatever it is. 1 patent granted, 2 progressing, done, out of there. You've taken about 15 seconds, and one of my questions has been answered, so I'm happy. So in a longer pitch, I would address this. In a short pitch, I think just really stick to the core and let people come and ask about anything they're interested in. So the team is really important. So I gather you had a presentation on this, so you know that the team is really important. Top risk, top factor for success, top factor for failure. So a fair amount of truth in that quick comment. The reason people care about the team is at this point in the presentation is that if things are going well, you've done a lot of great groundwork, and the question is, could you actually execute? So if I do invest, if peers invest, will you actually be able to do what you said you want to do? And so the key question is, do you have some expertise, have access to expertise in each of the key areas? There is usually a gap, particularly early on, and that's fine. But there are a couple of key points. You need to show people that you know where the gaps are. So I would say if you have 4 or 5 areas covered early on, for me, that would be fine. But I expect you to say that we are recruiting, we are obtaining expertise in this area. If you go through the presentation and you don't reassure the investor that you understand the problem well enough to know the expertise that you need, then I'd say that's kind of a risk. That's kind of a sort of a red flag, if you like. If you have a technically oriented team, again, thinking earlier stage, do you have access to sector-specific business development expertise? So there are different ways that you could obtain this. You may have somebody in the team. You may be working with an advisor, somebody connected to the company who has deep expertise in, for instance, selling complex medical equipment to hospitals, whatever the situation is. But again, it's really reassuring for an investor to know that you have identified that that's a key area and that you have actually started to bring that expertise into the team. Typically, it's really helpful to have a scientific advisory board, and there are particular headhunters, particular advisory groups can help you put these together. So the key question here is, are you supported by key opinion leaders in the domain? So the path of development is usually you get the company going, you make great strides. There's a point where actually it makes sense to have an advisory board. So you may have these in place. If you don't, I encourage you to think about this. And I guess in coaching situations, it's often an area that comes up. And often the advisory board can be phenomenally helpful, really, really useful in terms of opening doors, accessing networks. So think about an advisory board and perhaps internationalize that very early. So it's almost never too early if you have a really good proposition to begin to get hold of people, to begin to involve people in the development of the company. So we're getting towards the end of the pitch. I only have a handful sort of slides to go. And there is a typical flow to these presentations. So you definitely don't have to sort of address each of these topics in this order, but the key things come first, and then kind of like the exploitation plan comes second. So as you move towards the end, there are a couple of things you can do to really sort of showcase what you have. So the kind of, again, the colloquial English term is traction. So show who you're working with. If you come from a top institution, top university, you know, put the logo on the slide. If you're working or collaborating with great hospitals, industrial companies, put their logos on the slide. If you've won awards, you know, mention that. And in particular, if you have any feasibility pilot customers, you know, now, if you haven't mentioned it before, now is a great time, great point in the presentation to mention that. If you have a short customer story, you know, now is a great point to mention it. So I would kind of do it at this point rather than at the very, very beginning, but that may be a personal choice. But reassure people that you are developing connections, you're getting some engagement with users and with experts in the field. And I encourage you to use a final summary slide to address the key points. You actually don't need to talk to this, but something is on the projector, is on the computer screen at the end. So put up your core points. You can just be saying thank you. You can just be rounding out very nicely, again, making a nice positive finish, but actually emphasize what the key points are. So for me, you know, today, I think these are my key messages. So I just put these on the slide, but this is a kind of often an unused opportunity. You know, use this chance to really just re-emphasize what you think are your key selling points. So I encourage you to sort of relax and enjoy it. You know, presentations can be challenging, but they can also be great fun. People are listening. You have an audience. You're going to have, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30 people, a lot of whom really know their stuff, as it were, listening to what you're saying. So that can be slightly challenging, but it can be really enjoyable as well. You may get great feedback. Hopefully you'll at least get that, even if you don't get sort of anything else from that particular experience. But I think these are, you know, great skilled people listening to what you're saying. So enjoy that interaction. You know, you put a lot of time, a huge amount of effort into building the organization, building the company. So it should be positive to showcase that and let that come through. And there is a but. So I'm told there is a Dutch expression, which is never listen to anything an Englishman says until he gets to the but in a sentence. And I don't know whether that's true or not. So here is the but. Please manage the time. Time flies. It really does. A 7 or 8 minute pitch is a sensible amount of time to try and tell a story in. I personally dislike 5-minute pitches because you can never cover all of the key aspects and you have to make a choice. But just really manage the time. You'll have lots to say. You know your organization, you know what you're trying to do. So be positive about that, but manage the time. And somebody told me this years ago, and it's a thought that stayed with me, that people may not remember what you said, but they will remember how you said it. And it sounds trite, but I've actually concluded this is very important in life and business. So doing Zoom presentations is really hard. You know, we learn as we grow up to understand whether the person we're talking to is interested or not in what we're saying. If we're there physically with a person, it's different over Zoom. So just be bright, be positive, again, enjoy it. Let a little bit of energy flow through. You know, unfortunately, the camera is very revealing in good ways and bad ways. So if you're tired, if you had a lot of stress, you know, it probably will show. So just if you can, create a little bit of space to get ready for the presentation. Yeah, and Zoom is just really, really difficult. So just understand that this is harder. Everybody is trying to work through this process. A lot of the people in this business like talking to people. They like hearing about technologies. And now, you know, there they are. They're in an office. They're looking at a computer screen. So just understand that it's really quite difficult. And that, I think, is my final observation, other than to say always include the contact information. Again, you never know where those slide decks go. it's much easier for somebody on the other side just to pick up the last slide and email somebody than to start rooting around to find out who you should get in touch with. So thank you. We'll pause and we'll take questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Mark. Really, really interesting. I think we have also more questions in the chat, starting from Maya again. So Maya, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask because about the NDAs, before you were talking about the possibility that, of course, this investor is going to forward our presentation to others, either investors or some other partners they might have. Do you think that an NDA is necessary or needed or welcomed at any point and useful?
So in general, CDAs are not used until a reasonably advanced stage in discussions. Some VCs, so the corporate funds, certainly in pharma and biotech, will always be happy to sign a CDA, but it should come after the investor pitch. So the investor pitch is the advert. So if you have information you want to share that you think is valuable, some firms will sign CDAs after that. Others might say, well, let's have a let's have a couple of discussions first. So I think certainly in the pharma and biotech world, there is absolute integrity. I cannot think of a case where information has been misused. I'm sure that there must have been the odd example, but people understand how this works. So you present the information, this is treated with respect. Companies need to present hard numbers, hard projections to get interest, so people will treat this information with respect. So the typical process would be that you'd make the pitch, perhaps there'll be a follow-up meeting, then I would actually expect maybe a 1-hour discussion with some of the team, and perhaps at that point, if you actually wanted to sign a CDA, I think that would be reasonable. People are expressing interest, they want to find out more information. Some groups have quite firm policies that they will or will not sign CDAs. You should not be disclosing too much, but at the level of the pitch, you actually need to disclose to get the interest, and people will respect that and respect the process. Just make sure that you don't, I mean, it's an obvious point, but just make sure you don't put up anything that is patent sensitive on any of the slides. So it sounds silly, but it's a standard check question I use with people, and it's surprisingly often you actually have to take a diagram off or use a simplified diagram. That's the key issue, but most people will, certainly in pharma biotech, work in that fashion. Space may be slightly different, but I suspect it's very similar. Thank you. Okay, thanks for the questions.
And we have also a question from Marcus, but as said, he cannot use his microphone, so I will read it. He's asking, regarding the advisory board, what do you mean by key opinion leaders? Is this in terms of leading academy experts, or do you refer more to people with a level of influence, exposure within the industry? And what time length for pitch will you recommend we target for a one-to-one investor pitch?
Okay, so by key opinion leaders, it may be a medical jargon term. These typically are professors of medicine, individuals of that type, so typically academic experts in the field. So the advantage that they have is that they are not conflicted. You may find some independent sort of consultants who previously have run multinationals, run divisions of multinationals, something of that type. So they certainly would be relevant as well. Typically, this is leading academic experts. And one great thing about academics is that they collaborate, they talk to lots of people. So if you can persuade 3 or 4 leading academic figures that what you have is excellent, you will be able to access, networks, very, very high quality networks of hundreds of individuals. So in terms of trials, in terms of testing, it just begins to open things up. It can be a very useful way of expanding internationally, finding the first place to do a trial of some type. So that was really what I was referring to there. Individuals who are more industrial, more likely perhaps to be on the board rather than on the advisory board. But academics will be pleased to be associated with really high quality offers, but obviously you have to convince the individuals over time that what you have is something that's very, very good, but can be phenomenally useful, gives you a lot of extra reach. So the second question was around a one-to-one pitch. So I hope we'll be able to circulate the slides if I can manage to compress the pictures enough. And at the back of the deck, I've actually included some suggested contents for a 5-minute pitch, an 8-minute pitch, and what you might regard as a full pitch, something like a 15 to 20-minute pitch. So I've actually taken that from some of the tech tour materials and adapted that slightly. I find a really helpful way of developing the deck is to start with the full pitch. Start with the 15 to 20-minute slide deck. So if you are in an hour-long meeting, which will be typical, run through with a company what you have, you should not have more than sort of 20 minutes of core information, possibly with some backups, depending on, to anticipate particular questions. But I think personally, I find it easier. I think it's technical training as well to start with a long deck and shrink it down, because I think you edit that way quite effectively. So I find that easier than jumping to, here's the 5-minute pitch. So I suggest you start with a longer deck and try and sort of edit it down. I think that's effective as a way of really deciding what you have that's key. And it also means that you're very confident that you have the extra information if you want to jump to that. In terms of just a quick observation, when I was in GSK, exploiting technologies, looking for technologies to license, and I first picked up with each of the technical teams, I'll be given a 30-slide deck, which was good work that had been done. The only thing that usually interested me was the last 2 slides. So in some ways, these presentations are almost the inverse of a technical presentation. So you're starting by saying what you can do and then explaining how you can do that, rather than building forward to the punchline. But I do find it's really helpful to start with a longer deck and edit that down.
Actually, one of the questions from the chat is from Eloy Martinez. He was actually asking about how to manage different lengths of pitches.
Yes, I was asking about, you are explaining just right now. We started with a really big pitch deck, and we have started to reduce, and we have been collaborating. We have suffered, well suffered, because it was really nice to be an accelerator in June, July, and they told us that we have 8 minutes and 9 slides, only 9 slides. And how do you manage? Because maybe you need to go, in order to interest some investors to invest in your company, maybe you need to go to, I don't know, maybe 50 pitch decks, and you need to have backup slides, I guess. But how do you manage in your head to have different pitches, the 2 minutes, the 3 minutes, the 5 minutes, the 8 minutes, the 10 minutes, the 15 minutes? It's impossible for me. You have an story. I am selling all my life. I have been selling. I am sales. I was sales manager. I can start and not stop, but I am technical engineer. I am super engineer of telecommunications. I have also a post degree and MBA, and always it's difficult to find the key point to explain that they are expecting to have or to read or to hear. How do you manage this mental disease to have or 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes to manage the time? I am really able to manage the time. I know by mind, but if I have been explaining for 50 minutes, for 80 minutes, but my question is, how to put the right information on the right minutes? How do you manage it?
Okay, so one of the great things about working in this world is everybody is super qualified, super smart, super capable, but not everybody has done the same things. So I think there are a couple of observations. I think a 7 or 8 minute pitch is fair. Again, I've been being honest. I don't personally like 5-minute pitches because it's always a challenge. People are shoehorning things in. It's really uncomfortable. 7 or 8 minutes, if you're really good, you can cover most of the key points. And if you leave 1 or 2 things out, don't worry. So I think if you start with too long a deck, it's challenging, but start with what you actually might run through in an hour's meeting. If you were pitching to a board, what would you present? I think that's probably, that feels like that might be natural for you, and try and shrink that down. And it can be really hard because you know so much about the topic and you have such expertise to actually pull out the key issues. So if you can, you know, if you have a friend, if there is somebody who's semi-external in the group, if there is an advisor, if there's somebody in the incubator, I think that's a great thing to sort of take to them. You know, help me edit this down from, so instead of taking sort of 40 slides and going to 5, a helpful way of thinking about it is you start with nothing and build up to 5 minutes. As a different way of thinking about it. So you again, just try and set aside the idea that you're relaying everything that you know, or all the key points even about the project. Just give 5 minutes worth. But I think a good way of doing that is, obviously this works for me personally, it's worked with some of the organizations I've worked with, is to start with a reasonable technical deck and then just shrink it down, because actually it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. So I think that's helpful. But actually, I think if you're struggling, I think actually it's great for somebody who's just outside the problem, because you know so much and have such deep expertise that it's really hard to edit the work. So just I would suggest that somebody coming in and just helping you might be useful, but it's not easy. You know, it is far quicker to prepare a deck on how to do pitches than to prepare a pitch. So you know, I say that, you know, in truth. Working on a pitch for a company at the same time, and every slide is deeply considered. So it's quite easy to say you should do this. It's really challenging, but if you get it right, it's really powerful. It can have an enormous impact on people in the room.
One question. I think that we have now a 10-minute pitch desk. No bad. I'm not saying good. I am saying not bad. And the two first minutes, if you see the TED speakers, you see that at the first minutes, at the first minute, they are explaining a history, how they arrive to the business, how they arrive to build the company, how they arrive to have the company that they are promoting. In my 10-minute speech, I spent 2 minutes explaining this idea in order to motivate to hear the people can hear the message. Do you think it's interesting to spend more or less 2 minutes introducing the problem, and you will afterwards, you will, like in a monologue, link concepts with the first 2 minutes? You think is really a lot, or?
So again, this is only advice, and to some degree these are personal preferences. So however you got to the great development, the great organization you have, I think for this purpose I would set that aside. So I'm a great believer in beginning with the problem, and then explaining really early what you have that addresses the problem. I think anything else is sort of extraneous. It actually delays getting to the point. So everybody listening wants to know, you know, what a problem does this address? What is there here?
Yes, the presentation, the first presentation, the 2 minutes presentation is explaining fast the problem. You are alone on the middle of a desert, for example, and you explain the problem, and you are introducing the people to the problem, and afterwards you explain you are explaining the problem now and on this story. No, you are not explaining. I was alone in my garage when I was little, and I was dreaming about be rich. Not this. We are explaining a real situation suffered on the public, on the real life.
So I think it is reasonable to take 2 minutes on a sort of or to take 1.5 minutes, a minute on an 8-minute pitch to explain the problem.
It's reasonable. Is it reasonable, do you think?
So yes, so begin with the problem. So if that's what you're doing,
yes,
and you can use a kind of a story or a graphic or whatever you want. The only encouragement I would make, and I heard this from a group reviewing presentations last week again, is just move quite quickly to explain what you have. So if you start with a story, imagine a man in the desert. I don't know what you were, what the proposition was, but don't make people wait too long. to know what you have. We have a system that does X, enables him to find water, find his way home, find her way home, whatever. Then go and kind of explain more. So I just think it's important not to make people wait too long, because they again, they want to know, what is this? I've read the brief, but nonetheless, you know, what is there here? But what you're describing sounds fine. Again, just you have to gauge it to the time. 5 minutes is an incredible challenge. 7 or 8 minutes, you can take a minute, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes even, explaining what it is that's going on. And I think that works better.
Okay. And my third question is, I have my pitch deck has 10 slides. Maybe I will increase 1 or 2 maximum, but not with a lot of content. But what I need to explain, because I write down a script in order to learn by heart, and I have the slides also. And what you put in your script, what you explain, and what you put in your slides. My difficulty is, if you put really fulfill the slides, people will not understand nothing. And if you put only one photograph, people, if they are or sleeping or are really bored, they will read nothing, because they are maybe lose your messages. My question is, what you put in your words or what you put in your slides?
So I can only give general guidance. So I think there's the slides and your script, what you say, the two things work together. So you have to ensure that they dovetail, that they fit together really well. Personally, I'm in favor of including the key information in the slides. But if you make the slides too dense, people can't assimilate it in a quick pitch. So that actually is kind of discouraging, because if people are trying to follow, they actually struggle to read. So don't use kind of consultant's report style slides, but I do think you should include the key information. If you agree with a proposition that I think you're really pitching to people who understand your domain, the question is, what can reasonably be assimilated by somebody who's suitably expert? So again, a clinical development plan, somebody in the pharma industry, that can be assimilated quite well in a surprisingly few number of seconds. So it's a middle level of information. Don't make it off-putting, but do include the key points. Having said that, for a 5-minute pitch, again, we go back, it's a real challenge. So just understand that you cannot cover everything in 5 minutes. So there will be information that you leave out. And I think you have to shape the 5-minute advert as best you can. But if you take the benchmark as the 8-minute pitch, include enough information that the key story is told, even if you are not present. But a lot of the other issues, perhaps IP, perhaps some comments on the advisory board, those are things you can address verbally as you go through the presentation. I know that's general advice, but I think that's the best I can say in response.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Eloy, for your questions. I don't see more questions in the chat, so maybe we can. I don't know if anybody else has a question. Now is the moment to do it. If not, we can finish with the session.